Okay, so you recently announced on Twitter that you recently joined the Institutional Privacy Task Force at the Ethereum Foundation, or the IPTF for short.
Yes.
Sounds fancy, sounds important. It sounds like you're completing tasks. Do you mind telling the audience what the IPTF is for? What do you do there?
Yeah, so me and Mo, also from EF, we kind of kicked up IPTF like a few months ago now. And basically what we're trying to do is we're trying to onboard institutions onto Ethereum and making sure that their privacy requirements are met. It's both different and also interesting for a few reasons. First of all, one thing we're seeing is that, especially this year, more and more institutions, they want to build on public blockchains. And part of that is because of just the technology and ecosystem maturing. And part of that is also the fact that there's more regulatory clarity, whether that's in the US or Europe or Singapore or whatnot, or Japan with various types of regulations and so on. And that just makes it easy for these institutions to even start to think about it. But a big problem when it comes to moving onto public blockchains is in terms of making sure that their privacy requirements are met, because what they are used to, they're very sophisticated in terms of their business operations. So do some kind of trading or payment flows and whatnot. It's very, very complex, but it's a completely different world. And it's built up on these kind of legacy systems. And they would like to move things on chain for various reasons in terms of transparency and better settlement and access to liquidity and more affordances and so on. But a big blocker that we hear over and over again is just in terms of privacy. They want to move on chain, but they also want things to be private. And it's interesting because it's the technology need is very similar to the ones that we have been working on for a long time, but it's less cypherpunk in nature, if you will. It's less sovereign individual, fuck the state kind of thing, and more we want to make money and we don't want our competitors to see our secrets.
That message doesn't quite take with the big institutions.
Yeah, exactly. But the tools they want are very similar, right?
Yes.
And I think with Ethereum being this kind of credibility neutral base layer and a lot of this technology being very flexible, we can basically allow for both these kind of hardcore cypherpunks and also these institutions to both build on top of Ethereum with some differences, but a lot of overlap as well in terms of what they need. So what we're trying to do is first of all talk to them, so talking to these big institutions and understanding what they need and what the requirements are and what the problems are, how they're thinking about this, and just understanding the business use case. And then basically looking in the ecosystem and talking to various vendors in the space, as well as looking at ERCs that exist, so various specifications and so on, and seeing kind of what the solution space is, and then trying to map the demand, the problem space to the solution space and bridge that gap and create these kind of feedback loops. Because there's obviously a lot of work that's already been done, and just surfacing that, you can use this technology for this specific problem, but also in terms of maybe overlooked problems. So there might be some specific things that don't exist that is blocking institutions from getting on chain and stuff. So that's basically what we're trying to do. We're just trying to create these feedback loops and ultimately get institutions to build on top of Ethereum.
Can you give the audience a preview of some of the institutions that you might be working with or collaborating with?
Yeah, so it's a bit difficult because a lot of the reason institutions come to us is because they trust the Ethereum Foundation, and then we can be credibly neutral. So it's hard, and they also want to be able to talk to us without making a big press release or whatever. So
right.
Of course I can't talk about specifics, but it's
NDAs,
one of
it's NDAs,
yeah. But they're some of the biggest institutions in the world basically, and a lot of them they do want to eventually become more public about it. But what we see is that a lot of the use cases are very similar. So it's things like stable coins or some kind of payments. It's things like real world assets and things like structured products like bonds and whatnot. And these are massive markets, right? 100 times or 1,000 times bigger in terms of monetary flows than what we have on Ethereum today. So what's interesting is that what's happening is that maybe TradFi is moving more into the DeFi space and want to build on this public infrastructure. And then it varies a lot. There's a lot of specifics involved because depending on what jurisdiction we're talking about, the regulation is different and the requirements are different. For example, if you do payments between just a handful of banks with multiple millions of dollars, that's very different from issuing some kind of stable coin that's meant for retail customers. So they're both state payments and whatnot, but they are very, very different in terms of the solutions and requirements involved and stuff like that. Even though a lot of this is confidential and so on, what we want to do is we want to make as much as possible open source. So what we are doing is we are extracting these answers and creating this kind of public market map. That's a public good, and that's something we're working with the ecosystem with. So it's an open source repo, and in it we basically take and synthesize what we talk to these institutions about into use cases and explain what are the requirements, who are the actors, what performance targets do they need, and so on. And explaining kind of the relevant jurisdictions or regulations that apply, and then trying to map that basically in terms of approaches. So how you would pick certain vendors or specifications to ultimately solve your problem. And that's something that we need help from the ecosystem in terms of, because we know some stuff, but we don't know everything. And the Ethereum and the privacy ecosystem is large, so it's super useful. People come in with their own expertise and sort of help us build out this public good, because then we can sort of get people on board onto Ethereum, and people who work in their products, they can also make sure that they're solving the right problem, because it might be hard for them to talk to some of these biggest banks in the world, but we can sort of tell them a little bit about, like, here's what they actually need to move the needle. And that can also inform people in terms of what products they choose to work on and so on.
And do these institutions sort of like vary across the world? Like, are you talking to American institutions, European institutions, Asian?
It's a mix. Yeah, it's a mix from like America, Europe, Asia, if it's Singapore, Hong Kong, Japan, and so on. And they also vary a lot in terms of sophistication. So most of them are very sophisticated in terms of the business operation. And then some of them, they have had like a crypto R&D lab with 20 people who've been working on this, and they have like built their own sort of POCs and reports and ERCs and so on, whereas others are sort of just dipping their nose in. So it's kind of like a separate world, and we're just trying to sort of bridge that gap.
Okay, I see.
Yeah.
And so all the work that you're doing at the IPTF, how might users expect to see their experience of being on chain, using crypto products change meaningfully?
Yeah, so it's a good question. I think ultimately what we're trying to do is we want to sort of upgrade the infrastructure that sort of the world is running on, and this is like part of it. In terms of the alternative is that either we have these legacy systems, or people build on these like private chains, or we can sort of get them to build on this open infrastructure and getting these properties that we like, right? Like, we want to have self-custody, we want to have privacy, we want to have like ability to move our assets between different protocols, and we want it to be private and secure and open source and all of these things, right? So that's what we're building towards and trying to. And that's also what a lot of these institutions want. They just operate in a different framework. So ultimately, that will allow, instead of using these kind of legacy platforms and so on, you can sort of use on-chain products and still get access to, maybe it's like bonds or stocks or some real-world assets, or maybe being able to pay your rent for some stable coin or what have you, but doing so in a private way. Right. So I think that's kind of how things are moving. But a lot of it is like initially targeted towards institutions, and then it's ultimately up to what service they want to provide. But I think the way I see it is you have this kind of Wild West that still exists and is amazing in terms of people just being able to do whatever they want on chain, and cypherpunk, and people like maximum self-sovereignty. And that's amazing. We want to keep that. But at the same time, we also want to have these kind of other bubbles that are maybe operating in some kind of more regulated world. And I think they can coexist if you have a credibly neutral base layer. And basically what you have then is you have competition. And you already see that in the real world, where you have different jurisdictions that are competing against each other in terms of providing the best services for either companies or for individuals. So I think we will see like similar things going on in the crypto space.
Very cool. If you were to judge the progress meter, like between like adoption, or like where you see crypto is at right now and where the ideal state is, the 100% of Ethereum everywhere, crypto everywhere, like institutions on chain, privacy is fixed, like based on the work that you've been doing with the institutions, based on your own zero knowledge research and informing products and protocols, what percentage do you think we are at towards that ideal state? I
don't know. That's a hard question, man. I think it's like it's tough. It's very uneven, right? Because I think for some people they might feel like they're almost there, like they have a workflow for doing their on-chain transactions privately, and like some people are very, very sophisticated now already, so they would be like close to 80%. But then the fact is like most people are nowhere near that, and most institutions are nowhere near that, so it would be like 5%.
5%.
So like, what's the average? No, like so I don't know what the average is. Is it hard? 30%? I think it's like organic process, right? Where you have like this alternative parallel system and it's kind of too big to ignore. So now you have these like incumbents that are like, okay, we can't ignore this anymore. Like we can't fight this. So we have to figure out how to live with it or interact with it. Right. And I think that's what we see happening now. Yeah, we're talking about institutions. Like I think a lot of them, they have stable coins and they have these real world assets, but a big blocker is in terms of actually making it private, because they realize that it doesn't really work for their use cases if it's not actually private. So that's a big blocker. And like the fact that there's some regulatory clarity is very useful for those institutions in terms of how they operate. I think there's like a lot of other parallel things going on. So as I mentioned about like being CKPL before, that also goes for like legislator rights. And goes back to the whole idea of like network states and these types of ideas where you're not just like using existing legal frameworks, but you're trying to sort of create new policy and new legal frameworks that are more well-informed of how the technology actually works, and even creating these like parallel societies that can sort of compete with existing societies. So I think you will see all kinds of, like from the crypto anarchist hardcore taking over like a boat in the middle of nowhere and just doing your own thing, all the way to like the most boring kind of TradFi, New York, whatever thing you can imagine, like everything in between, right? And it will have these feedback loops, and ultimately, hopefully, the systems we build are better for it, and people are better off.